Hey, morning guys, I'm the Tech Prepper. Hope you're all doing well. So today I want to talk a little bit about a project I just finished, and that was setting up Windows for off-grid computing. And while I'm not a Windows user and prefer Linux, there was enough value in some tooling based on my ability to set that up quickly and efficiently where I had to use Windows. I've always been burned by Windows, especially as a field operator, mostly because I didn't take certain precautions when setting that up. Now, I've been in tech since 1997, got my first computer in 1994. It was a Packard Bell Pentium 175 megahertz. At that time, the internet was in its early state of being, and access to the internet was really through expensive per minute charges using dial-up, which was slow, but most of the software that we got at that time came from big box stores, shrink wrap solutions where you physically gave them money for a box that had a floppy disk, a CD, a DVD, whatever the case was, and you physically owned a copy of that. And you can install the operating system from that and all of your applications. We have moved away from that model at what I think would be a real disservice to everybody. I see the industry, specifically Apple and Microsoft, moving to a model where they don't want you to own your compute devices. They basically want you to have that thing connected to the internet 24 hours a day. And like you're going to find in probably the coming months or years, there will be internet outages, there will be grid disruptions. And the last thing that I want is something that I value as a tool, because I use these things as offline communications tools. I use them as offline resources for references. I don't want to be tied to those vendors. So I'm taking precautions now to be able to basically jump into my mid-90s time machine and prepare everything I need to reinstall everything so that this thing functions 100% offline, so I can use it as a tool if it ever comes to it. Before we get started, there are a few caveats I have to put in front of you. Number one, I am a Linux user and a Mac user, and I really don't use Windows. In fact, I completely stopped using Windows around the Windows 7 days, and even at that time, I was really jumping between Linux and Mac at that time. So what you're going to hear here is from the perspective of someone who has legacy knowledge and is trying to make Windows work in the way that it worked mostly from the Windows 7 days. Number two, as a Linux user, there's an inclination to do everything in Linux, and I get that, and I know that I have a large audience of people that are not tech savvy, and Windows seems to be the platform for that market. So I had an initial urge to jump into something called Wine and do emulation of Windows under Linux, but decided not to. And my plan, as usually is the case, is I will dual boot all my machines with the preferred version of Linux I'm using at that time, and in this case, Windows 10 with all the customizations I'm going to walk you through. So that is the context by which we're looking at this. If you are a technical person, this video is not for you. This is more intended for the non-technical person that wants to have some independence and make sure that their compute devices work in a scenario where there is no access to the internet, and this requires preparation. Just like everything on this channel regards to preparation, you have to do work today. So hopefully there'll be some homework for everybody that wants to follow along with what I did a few weeks ago. Just one more thing. So just for the fun of it, I wanted to show you guys that I actually do still run my old Windows 95 machine, and I actually have a bunch of the software. So this is what software used to look like. I have a copy of Mist. No, this was not my original copy of Mist. I bought this as old new stock about 10 years ago. But this is my copy of Microsoft Visual Studio. Heck, I even have copies of Windows 95 A, B, and C on CD-ROM, if that is still a thing. But heck, when I went back and even went ahead to install Windows 95 about 10 years ago, I had to buy old new stock of 3.5-inch floppy disks. You can actually see that's a Microsoft floppy disk right there. So not that we're going to get into using old media. We'll use new media technology like these USB drives. But the point is, it's 2024. Windows 95 came out almost 30 years ago. Am I doing the math right? Yeah, almost 30 years ago. And I still have the ability on my old machine to reinstall everything like it was from the factory all these years later, and that is the goal of this episode and what I want to do with my compute devices. Let's talk about success criteria. So success for me is being able to take any one of the computers I have here, whether it's 1 year from now or 10 years from now, and being able to reinstall the operating system, all the applications, and the data I need without ever connecting it to the internet. We're going to do something called sneaker netting, and that is the concept of if we need to get some software today to make this happen and prepare this media, we're going to use a secondary computer. I'm going to use my main MacBook Pro that I use for work. I'm going to download all of the Windows software programs that I need, and I'm going to copy them to external USB drives. So step one is really having a plan to use a second system that is connected to the internet to download all of the media we need for our off-grid build. The core of these computers is the operating system, so we need to have the ability to reinstall the operating system. In the case of Microsoft Windows, you can go to the windows.com website and you can actually download what they call an ISO image and save that onto a USB drive. Now, traditionally what you would do is take a USB drive that was large enough and you would take imaging software and you would write that to your USB drive. Then when you want to reinstall your operating system, you would boot into your BIOS, boot off of the USB drive, and then it would allow you to prepare the operating system for installation on your computer. So really straightforward, but I have found that that can be wasteful, especially since USB drives are a little bit bigger now, and carrying a bunch of USB drives from multiple different operating systems gets out of hand quickly. Now, I think a viewer commented well over a year ago that there was something called Ventoy, and I did a YouTube short on that. I'll put that up here. And what Ventoy allows you to do, it basically puts a very small bootloader on a USB drive. Let's say that we're going to do a 32 gig USB drive. We load the software on there. At this point, we can copy as many ISO images, the installers for Windows, multiple copies of different Linux distributions, and put those on there, space permitting. So what I have here is basically what I call my Ventoy drive, and this allows me also to boot off of this using the BIOS, selecting the USB drive, and then I'm presented with a menu that says, do you want to run the Windows or boot into Windows or boot into all of these versions of Linux. So this is somewhat of a Swiss Army knife that I recommend is if you have multiple copies of operating systems that you want to be able to install from, Ventoy is a good way to have all of them on a single drive. And I've been using these Gorilla 3.0 drives. They're not the fastest things in the world, but I bought them because they are in alignment with my style of operation, which is high temperature environments, and they are very well sealed. And I don't know if they're IP67 rated, but these things are probably a little bit more robust than the standard USB drives you'll find out there. And I haven't had one yet fail on me in the last couple of years. So I'll put a link down below if you guys want to pick that up with the affiliate link. So the installation of Windows is way out of the scope for this video, but again, the generalized approach is to download the ISO image from Windows. It's completely free today. So for me, as long as all of the hardware that I need works on that version of Windows, I will continue to use it. I'm not one of those people that chases updates all the time. In fact, I believe that new is the enemy of stable and causes lots of problems. So I'm actually using a 2-year-old version of Windows 10. So I would download that first, write it to your USB drive following the instructions, boot off of it, and install Windows. As I mentioned, I want to make sure that this is an air-gapped device. I never want it connected to anything tied to the internet or any network for that matter. And that's because since I'm going to be running older software, I don't want to have any type of vector for something to get in there. So really the only attack vector for what I do is someone would have to be within radio range, craft a very specific exploit over radio that will take over my system. It's a very unlikely scenario. So with that said, I'm going to go through some of my notes. I was new to installing Windows 10, so this is not a comprehensive list, but these are the activities I went through in trying to make this work for my needs. So number one, I installed from good known media. I used that Windows 10 copy I had from a couple years ago. And I can verify that it was from Microsoft and not something that was pirated. Number two, do not connect it to Wi-Fi. As part of the installation, it's going to want you to do that. Absolutely say no thank you, I don't have Wi-Fi, and just move on. In fact, never ever ever connect this thing to the internet is my best practice. Okay, so this is where the configurations or customizations that come in. I'm going to share the ones that are specific to my needs. So number one, I rely on this for radio communication, and oftentimes, like the Panasonic that's behind me, it's sitting there running 24 hours a day, and I don't want it to do anything wacky like hibernate or sleep. So the very first thing I do is actually for the battery and connected to AC, I basically tell it, do not turn off anything. The only thing that I will turn off is the screen because it really doesn't matter. So like right now, for example, I've got this guy with those power settings, but if I move the mouse, then it'll obviously turn right up. So that's the only thing that I will have basically in terms of power management enabled, is turning off the screen after 5 minutes when on battery power and maybe 10 minutes when connected to AC mains. So another thing too, I'm a field operator and I need my screens as bright as possible. Unfortunately, the Panasonic FZM ones that I love are only a 500 nit display, which is not terribly bright. And then of course, to save power, Windows will try to back this down. So I also display the auto brightness and sensor and keep it fully maxed out. When I operate in the field, it's for targeted windows, so I don't mind wearing down the battery if I'm able to see the screen more effectively and do my job and then break everything down. One thing I will tell you about Windows, and this has happened to me a couple times, I think even on this channel, I have had this thing connected to the internet. Behind the scenes or in the background, it has downloaded Windows patches, did not install them. I took this machine to the field a couple months later, and I can't remember if it was on startup or shutdown. It tried applying the patches that next time I rebooted or went into the field to turn it on. And my problem there really is, this is my machine. I don't want you messing with it, Microsoft. And they prevented me, one, from either hitting my communication window or keeping me at that location, which is typically an austere environment, longer than I would have liked, and also consuming my valuable compute resources like the battery while it was trying to apply those updates. So the very first thing I do is disable Windows Update. And I found a utility I'll put up on the screen. It's called WU10MAN. So it completely disables everything. I actually did that install, and I have not seen it try to do anything related to Windows Update for well over a month here. I would say as SOP, let's not enable Windows Update and fully disable it using this program. All right, we're going to read some more notes here. And again, these are physical notes that I prepare for myself. So if I ever have to do it, I'm actually able to go through and execute these steps. The other thing I'll do is disable tablet mode, since most of my stuff is in tablet form factor, and I find it very difficult to use, and I have no idea what all those little tiles, like it's so busy and just gets in the way of me using it as a tool. I'll also hide Cortana or disable Cortana altogether, mostly because I don't need a voice assistance. I don't want that running. I don't want any listening devices, so I turn that off as well. Again, I came from the early Windows days, and I had liked the simplicity of the desktop experience from about Windows 7 and prior. So I did some research and I found a tool called Classic Shell, and it basically allows you to turn your system into a classical Windows experience with just a simple start menu, clean desktop, and that's how I like to personally run my systems, and I found it to be very handy. Now, for these two last software packages that I'm telling you about, we'll get into this in a minute, but I have a second USB drive that has all of the software that I need after a Windows install. So this USB drive has a Windows directory, and in that directory, it has that tool to disable Windows Update, as well as the Classic Shell and a handful of other applications. So again, the point is these USB drives give me the ability to get everything on my machine back to a known state without ever connecting it to the internet. A few other things I'll do is I'll clean up the taskbar and remove a bunch of the pins. Like I said, I don't plan on doing email and all that stuff, so I try to keep it as uncluttered as possible. Like I mentioned, Windows for me has some value, and there's some areas where I think they have tooling that is superior to running under Linux, and that has to do with some of the modes. For example, I found as an operator or radio operator that WinLink Express and using Vara FM are actually really well suited to run under Windows Basically making those work under Linux requires a little bit more effort than I wanted to put in. And if I need to use WinLink Express to send email using Vara, I'll just use my dual boot machine. I'll boot out of Linux and boot into this Windows setup. So for WinLink Express, I want to make sure that I have copies of all of that software. And again, reading on more notes here. So bear in mind, I'm also keeping physical notes along with how to do this. So if I need to reinstall, again, don't want to beat this one to death, I have the ability to do that. So on one of my offline USB drives, I went and downloaded all of the Vara or all of the WinLink applications. So the ability to pull all of that and copy it over to this system. And then I have a full installation notes. I've shared this with the Buy Me Coffee members, because one thing I found is setting up something like your radio to do email over radio is a task in of itself. And most people will go to the internet, look up at some YouTube video or download maybe the PDFs and try to reconfigure the system. You can't do that when the internet is down. So this is why I personally wrote my approach and documented exactly what I need to do. And I've replicated this thing on my everyday kind of EDC tablet. And I confirm that it all works. And then I have everything properly backed up. And I basically have a multi-step checklist that even goes into all of the load level details of configuring the modem, all of those settings. So really handy. And guys, this is where planning comes in. I know this stuff takes work, and I spent, an entire weekend basically building this off-grid Windows system. And I just kind of incrementally worked through all of these pieces and built out all of the little software packages, copying them over one at a time from my main computer to this drive, sneakernetting them, installing them. And then at that time, again, I was using online resources, but taking offline notes so that I could redo this without the internet in the future. So in terms of goals and what Windows is for me, it's going to be different for everybody else, but I'm not installing everything that I need here. Basically, I made Windows a useful platform that doesn't get in my way. It doesn't try to hibernate when I don't want it to. It doesn't try to install updates when I don't want it to. And I've also been very selective on how many applications I put on here, because I don't need everything. The purpose for me on this one is to basically do maybe program my radios, because most of that software is Windows based, and be able to use Vara over WinLink, and that is about it. So the other things I do have on here, just to make things easy, so on the desktop, I have WinLink Express, which allows me to send the emails over WinLink. I have a shortcut to the device manager, mostly because it's in the Windows world, you do need to have access to your COM or serial ports. Sound modem, since this is primarily an email system over radio, sound modem is what I use for the packet-based networking. Vara FM is another mode I'll use to send email with this and a radio. And then I also purchased a copy of multi-PSK, but not that I intend to use multi-PSK. The creator, if you download and buy a license, includes an application called clock.exe. And for what I like to do, some of the modes of communication, the accurate clock timing is important. And the cool thing about clock.exe is that you right-click it, run as administrator, have your radio connected to it. I've been using the DigiRig Lite for this that I've talked about, and I'll use a radio that is capable of receiving an AM broadcast station on either 2.5, 5, 10, 15, or 20 megahertz. Tune it there, and there is a WWV synchronization option, and the clock.exe service will actually listen to those transmissions over time, decode the information, and actually set your clock offline. In the past, I've showed people how to do this just by audibly listening to it and then hitting the set clock yourself, but this is an automated way of just letting it run in the background. So again, this took some planning because I actually had to go buy a license before I needed it. I had to decide if I wanted to make that investment, and for me the answer was yes. It gives me another tool and another way of setting my clock in a way that doesn't really require a grid tie. So long as that station in Fort Collins or Hawaii is broadcasting and I can hear it, I can set my clock offline down to a handful of milliseconds, which is cool. So the last application I have here is called Cleopatra, and that is for essentially encrypting and decrypting files or messages using private key, public key cryptography, which basically, we're not going to get into it in this video, but it allows the person that I'm encrypting and sending the payload to verify that it is me, and likewise the other way around. And as long as you are good about not leaking your key, observing good practices, you can be pretty certain that the data that you're receiving from both ends will be secure. It's trust no one security. So I'm using Cleopatra, but the question is, this isn't connected to the internet. Why do you have it? Well, I did an experiment that I'm going to talk about on the Buy Me a Coffee private member live stream at this month, and I'm going to show people how I basically did something that is 100% legal, doing encryption over radio. So number one, I'm using the WinLink software on Windows, my Android phone, and Linux, and I've got the same private public key abilities to encrypt and decrypt traffic on all three of those platforms. I have the ability to connect my radios on Windows, Linux, and my Android device. And WinLink has a mode called P2P or peer-to-peer. So I can encrypt the message that I want to send using my private key, and I can send that over radio, and I can decrypt it or the person I want to send it to within my business can decrypt that. So it's really interesting to basically have the ability to, as secure as can be, on my UHF frequencies, to send encrypted email to my buddy who is about 15 miles away from me, and we've got line of sight. Where something goes wrong, we have an SOP where we both know to turn on our stations. One of us will be the P2P receiving station, and I can go ahead and encrypt a payload that has sensitive information and send it over my business license, completely legal. I have no intention of doing this on the amateur radio bands, but again, this is why I have some encryption software. Again, this is software that I have saved and have put on my USB drive. So in a nutshell, that is basically my approach to deploying a off-grid, offline, air-gapped Windows system that works in the way that I need it to work without these operating systems getting in my way. I have complete control over its installation and when it does things. And that's exactly what I want for emergency preparedness. Now, I wasn't going to show you all of this, but I do want to also kind of briefly walk through some of the pieces of information I'll store on my offline USB drive. Now, this is not a CyberDeck, for those of you who guys are familiar with that. CyberDecks are kind of cool. They basically will take this concept of downloading whole copies of document stores like Wikipedia and having them available for offline use. I can certainly do that with this system. In fact, I plan to. But my offline USB drive has a couple things I wanted to share. Number one, I always do label it with the year, month, and date at which it was copied, because I do have like a source repository of that stuff. But just to give you guys some ideas, so I've got information for my community emergency response team. I have my contacts. I have a bunch of ebooks that I've collected over the year on a lot of different subjects, so some offline reference material. Got a bunch of little how-tos. These are how-to articles that I actually wrote for myself, and it actually includes for things like maintenance on the RV, maintenance on the Jeep. So there are all of these little things that, I've done a handful of times, but maybe have forgotten, and just allow me really quickly to get back up and running again. I've got a bunch of stuff on land navigation and maps. I really enjoy spending time in the backcountry, so I've got maps for my area. In terms of radio, there's a lot here for radio. I've got my field manuals, my field cards, my SOPs, frequencies. I mean, this thing is a gold mine. Most of this stuff I have shared with the Buy Me a Coffee members. It's got all of the radio software that I need to reinstall everything. So that, more than anything, is what I lean on. And I've also downloaded every single PDF and manual for every single radio and radio appliance that I have. So if I ever need to look up how to do some obscure task on it, it's only a click away. Software is a mix of software for Windows, Linux, and Android. On the Android front, I'm also a believer in, where possible, if you have access to the actual installers or the APK, which you do in most cases for the amateur radio software, I have physical copies of those. Again, it's a point in time, but I have the ability to reload and reinstall without the internet my amateur radio software on my Android device. But anyways, this is very specific to what I need. You can make adjustments if there are videos or other things that you need, maybe for medical, who knows, those would be good candidates to have here. All right, guys, I know this video was a bit long. I almost didn't record it, mostly because I didn't think people would be interested in this topic. If you do like it, please consider giving me a thumbs up or a like or whatever the heck they call it these days. Subscriptions are also welcome. I'm trying to hit 100,000 subs because I feel that, as someone who's in technology, that the things I talk about probably are going to be important. I don't trust any tech whatsoever. In fact, I don't rely on this. It's a tool, and I have, I'll use it, especially when I need it, but I'm not going to rely on it because tech is very fragile, and it seems to be getting a lot more fragile than it used to be. But anyways, for the Buy Me a Coffee guys, we're going to do the whole topic on encryption on the member live stream on Saturday the 27th at 7 a.m. PDT, so that should be fun. I'm the Tech Prepper. No coffee today. Be strong, be safe, and be prepared.